Everybody, on behalf of the family members of Sankar Aiyar, especially our beloved and most respected Sankar Aiyar sir, and the family members and the dignitaries, and SIRC of ICAA, we present before you the 11th Sankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture. I request Miss Yamini Aiyar and our beloved and most respected Sri Sankar Aiyar to come on dais, please. I request Mrs. Sankar Aiyar, Madam, also to come on dais, please. We are having ICAA election code. Accordingly, we are maintaining certain requirements of the election code. We request everyone to stand up for the Institute's motto song as a mark of respect for ICAA, a great institution. Members and invitees, the Honorable former Union Minister of Panchayat Raj and Development of Northeastern Region, our most respected Sri Sankar Aiyar, inaugurated the first Sankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture on Friday, May 9th, 2008, on the theme Panchayat Raj, Inclusive Growth through Inclusive Governance, in this same venue, Ramaya Memorial Hall. Between 2003 and 12, we have conducted 10 memorial lectures. This is the 11th memorial lecture. And we have been instituting number of memorial lectures in honor of the dignitaries and luminaries of the CA profession. So far, we have conducted 10 memorial lectures on topics like the economics of global India, relevance of social justice and social development in India, economic reforms for inclusive growth, empowering Panchayat Raj through technology, like that. So many luminaries in the economic development of the country has addressed this memorial lecture. And this memorial lecture is in memory of late Sri Sankar Aiyar sir, a GDA who became a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, who passed away in the year 1953. Honorable Sri Sankar Aiyar is the eldest son of Sri Sankar Aiyar. On the initiation of our Sankar Aiyar sir, an endowment fund to the tune of 5 lakh rupees has been instituted in the SIRC and we are utilizing the interest accrued out of this fund, for conducting this program on behalf of SIRC and the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and the CA profession. We express our deepest gratitude to Sankar Aiyar sir. And with this background about this lecture, we would like to extend the welcome to the dignitaries on the dais. I request Miss Saraswati Harikaran to come forward to present a shawl to our Honorable Sri Sankar Aiyar sir. I request CA Garima Bai to come forward to present adorn the shawl to Miss Yamini Aiyar. It's a mark of our respect. I request Garima Madam to adorn shawl to Mrs. Sankar Aiyar sir. We are honored with the presence of our Gopalakrishna Gandhi sir, amongst our audience. I would like to honor him also with the shawl, and I request Saraswati Harikaran Madam to honor him. Sri Gopalakrishna Gandhi sir, who is the grandson of our Mahatma Gandhi, has also graced this memorial lecture in 2014 with a title Being a Tamilian in Delhi and Indian in Chennai, like that. I request the dignitaries to assemble for the floral tributes to our most respected and late Sri Sankar Aiyar. Before we formally request Yamini Aiyar Madam to deliver this memorial lecture, I take it as an honor to request Sankar Aiyar sir to come and say a few words. Honorable Governor
Gopu Gandhi Avarle, members of the ICAI Southern India branch, students largely from the Asian College of Journalism, and all friends gathered here. I just want to say a few words about my father so that you are able to understand why we have this annual lecture here on Nungambakam High Road. My father was, as far as I know, a founder member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. But very soon after the institute was founded, my father, V. Sankar Aiyar, was killed in an air crash as the plane took off from Palam Airport, Delhi, in the direction of Mumbai. And 50 years after he passed away, a suggestion was made that by Mr. N.D. Gupta, who is now a member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha, it is he who proposed to the headquarters of the institute that such a lecture might be instituted in memory of my father. That proposal, however, did not see the light of day, and it was only a few years later that here in Chennai, the Southern India branch kindly agreed, Southern India Regional Center, kindly agreed to host this lecture. And in doing so, I have not been inhibited about asking my family members to deliver several of these lectures. Because my brother, Swaminathan, is among the most well-known economic journalists in the country. Unfortunately, he delivered his lecture in the middle of my election campaign. So that is the only lecture I did not attend. My sister Tara has been specializing in social work ever since she my sister Tara has been specializing in social work ever since she stood second in Delhi University for her master's in social work. So I took the liberty of asking her to speak. And now we have V. Sankar Aiyar's granddaughter, who is the president of the Center for Policy Research, perhaps India's leading think tank, appointed at the age of 40 to deliver the lecture today. But apart from members of the family, we've had a number of other distinguished speakers as well. I would particularly like to repeat what has already been told to you, that among our distinguished lecturers has been Governor Gopal Gandhi. We've also had Ram Guha, we've had Montek Singh Ahluwalia, we've had Vijay Kelkar, and we've had Paranjoy Thakurta. So we've been trying to spread the net wide, but I have not been inhibited in asking members of my family to also come from time to time to speak to this audience. And I shall continue to do so, for I see no reason why we should draw a veil over the children and grandchildren of V. Sankar Aiyar, as they are also contributing in their own way to keeping that tradition alive. It was said of my father, I'm sure it's an apocryphal story, but it is said of my father that he knew the Income Tax Act so well that when he was once challenged in the appellate, the particular section he recited backwards to the judge who was sitting in the appellate tribunal to make him understand that he knew the law better than the judge did. I'm sure this is an apocryphal story, but it is an illustration of his eminence in the profession at that time. Curiously, his entire career as almost his entire career as a chartered accountant, was not here in Tamil Nadu, which is where it should have been, because he graduated from Pachapas College, Madras as it was called then. He was the first member of our family, our extended family, to graduate. But at that time, it was difficult for somebody called Aiyar to get himself a job here in Madras. So in sheer anger, he jumped into a train and took it to the farthest point that he knew then. It was the Grand Trunk Express, and he got off in Lahore. And there one Mr. P.N.S. Aiyar had preceded him by 9 years. Appa got articled to Mr. P.N.S. Aiyar, and from 1927 till 1947, for 20 years, he practiced in Lahore. And his practice was so successful, but largely confined to clients in the belt from Peshawar to Karachi, that in 1947, Appa decided that if he had to choose between being an Indian and a Pakistani, he would prefer to be a Pakistani so as to continue the services he was rendering to his Pakistani clients. There was a grocer, a sabziwala, who lived near his house, who told him that this madness will end in a few days, so you put a big padlock on your door, and I'll tell everyone that Sankar Sahib has gone to Hindustan. And after a week, when this lunacy ends, you can continue living with us as you have lived with us for 20 years. But 2 or 3 days after that, the same grocer pulled a knife on my father. And so my father got his MA in political science overnight at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he realized that he couldn't continue in Pakistan, that there had been a cataclysmic change in the whole situation. And so he rang the Dalmias, got a truck, and he was very, very lucky that on one of the worst days of the carnage, on the short distance of half an hour between Lahore and Wagah, he succeeded in escaping alive, came across the border, and that is how the family got reunited, because all of us used to spend the summer in Simla, where my father would come from time to time for meetings of the appellate tribunal, and so Amma would keep house for him there. So on the 14th, 15th August, his wife and children were Indians, and he was a Pakistani. Anyway, he came across and was just settling into India when this air accident took place. And fortunately or unfortunately, none of his children was interested in following this profession. But my father's elder brother had an army of daughters. And what Appa did was that he was very careful that only Ashta Sahasram Aiyars would be recruited by him as articled clerks. And once they proved their merit, he would marry them to one of his nieces. And so there's a whole army of sons-in-law of the family who have been running the chartered accountancy business ever since my father passed away. They include famous names like Sri Krishna Aiyar in Calcutta, S. Srinivasan, who is Raja is not here it seems, but his son Raja was with us. He's having difficulty in getting from Bombay because his flight was greatly delayed. But there's Srinivasan, and then there was Ganeshan, who was perhaps the most famous of all. All of these are sons-in-law of the family. But now, alas, my eldest cousin, Venkata but everyone knew him as Manian, he passed away last month. And so the direct connection of the family to the profession is in danger of being extinguished. But still at all, we regard all of you as part of our extended family, and I'm most grateful to the SIRC of ICAI that year after year after year, they welcome us and look after us over here. And now over to V. Shankar Aiyar's granddaughter, who is going to who started an NGO called Accountability Initiative before being promoted to her present position as President of the Center for Policy Research, and based upon her life and experience as the founder president of Accountability Initiative, she's going to speak to you about a matter that is tangentially part of your professional life, not as a chartered accountant, but one who believes that accountability is the essence of effective democracy. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving a brief about your daddy and the settlement in India. Just I was remembering my reading a book, a popular book on freedom in midnight. So that carnage that has happened between India and Pakistan. I am honored to stand before you to introduce an eminent scholar like Yamini Aiyar, who is the President and the Chief Executive of CPR. Her research interests are in the field of social policy and development. In 2008, Yamini founded the Accountability Initiative at the CPR, that is the Center for Policy Research. Under her leadership, the Accountability Initiative has produced significant research in the areas of governance, state capacity and social policy. Yamini Aiyar is a TED Fellow and the founding member of the International Experts Panel of the Open Government Partnership. She has also been a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Council on Corporate Good Governance. Previously, she has worked in the World Bank's Water and Sanitation Program and Rural Development Unit in Delhi, where she focused on action research aimed at strengthening mechanism for citizen engagement in the local government. Aiyar is an alumna of the London School of Economics, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University, and St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Kindly join your hands to give you a very warm welcome to this. Thank you. Over to Yamini.
Good evening, everyone. Governor Gopal Gandhi, members of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India's Southern India Regional Council, students, ladies and gentlemen, my father and mother. It's a real honor and deeply personal moment for me to be here delivering this lecture. When Appa first asked me to speak here some months ago, I thought I was indulging my extremely indulgent father, whose pride and joy in his children is at one level deeply indulgent and completely unfounded, but at another very, very infectious. But as I thought harder about what I was going to speak about today, I also had to look at that picture which hangs very close to my flat where we live in Delhi, and think a little bit more and in many ways establish a connection with my grandfather, who's a person I never knew, but whose presence in our lives has always been extremely, he's always been present and very much there. Appa tells us lots of stories, as Appa loves to live in his memories and his anecdotes. And through those stories and anecdotes, we got to know my grandfather in very different ways, as a father, as a husband, and most importantly, as a professional. And it struck me that he perhaps left this world not much older than I am today. And yet, he left a professional and personal legacy so deep that even all these years later, every time I encounter chartered accountants, in fact, I discovered somewhat inadvertently that the accountants for the institution I run are Sankar Aiyar and Company. His name always comes up. And people talk of him with such respect and such pride for what he contributed to the profession that it makes me almost more aware of my own roots and the deep relevance of my grandfather, and the sense of his legacy that lives on, and I hope in different ways we can contribute as his grandchildren to that legacy. So as I indulged my appa, I think I've also felt a deep connection with my grandfather, someone I didn't know, but for someone who's obviously a deep part of me in many ways. In my own work, the idea of being an accountant seemed almost impossible. I certainly don't have the talent, definitely don't have the diligence or the patience to be a good accountant. But perhaps there is something of him in me, because through my work, I began to engage with the idea of accountability quite early on. Not quite in the way that all of you do, which is quite literally taking the books of accounts and keeping all of us in check. We all breathe a huge sigh of relief every time the auditor submits their reports and our board signs off. It knows that we are okay for this year. So we are aware of the very important work that auditors do. But taking the same idea of accountability in the context of how we as citizens interact with our governments. And in the work that I have done over the last decade or so, what we've been trying to do is, in fact, become accountants of government as citizens ourselves. And it's that idea that I wanted to engage with all of you, to try and, as accountants for all of you, to make you think a little bit differently about the idea of accountability and what it means in very, very everyday ways in our lives when it comes to going to a government school, going to a government hospital, interacting with the government to get our passports, our licenses, your licenses as a practice. The whole idea of accountability, in fact, is not just confined to the books of accounts, but to the very everyday experiences we have as individuals, as professionals, and as citizens. I'm going to focus largely on the idea of accountability from the perspective of us as citizens in terms of our relationship with government. And this is an idea that I think animates all of us in many different ways. When you think about government in India, I think the first thing that comes on most people's minds is corruption. And the second word that comes to most people's minds is accountability. The idea of corruption as being very much embedded and ingrained in how the government runs is also an idea that has mobilized a lot of our politics. It facilitated the creation of a whole new political party, the Aam Aadmi Party, that is now in the government in Delhi. It facilitated the ousting of a previous government, my father's party, and his government brought in a new government on the promise of anti-corruption and good governance. It brought in the whole idea of good governance into our vocabulary as in our democracy. It's also now, I think, posing quite serious questions on how our current government is functioning. It mobilized people even on the idea of demonetization, that it was about corruption that brings India together. So somewhere, even though we don't always use the word accountability, we talk about corruption, and it serves as a tool of mobilizing all of us and converting us into political citizens. But I want to take that away. I want you to think about accountability not as corruption. I want you to start engaging with the idea of accountability in a much broader way through the course of this lecture. And of course, we'll come back to the idea of corruption, because ultimately that, I think, is one of the key issues that animates any discussion on government and any discussion on accountability. And as accountants, I suspect you have to deal with very different types and forms of corruption in your own work in different ways. So let me first begin by giving you a little bit of a definition of accountability outside of being chartered accountants. At a very prosaic level, the idea of accountability is essentially the ability of one actor to demand a justification or an explanation of another for their actions, and based on that explanation or demand, reward or punish. It's a fairly basic, simple concept, and it's a concept that is deeply relational. It's about how we as individuals relate to one another, we as professionals relate to one another, we as citizens relate to our governments. But it is also a very important concept in the context of how it frames the dynamic of power. And in that sense, it's about a shared sense of power. So the ability to ask and demand an explanation, demand justification, ask for accountability is itself the ability to exercise power. And the extent to which one has delegated power to somebody to act on one's behalf, for which we ask for an explanation and justification, is from the other side an action of power. So in many ways, I think the interesting thing about accountability is that it gives you a very important framework to understand the experience of and the expression of power. And ultimately, the art of governance is about the art of a careful, responsible dispensation of power. When we think about the nature of accountability and we take it into the context of democracy, one would think that the two are quite neatly interlinked. After all, the act of democracy, the art of democracy, the practice of democracy is very much about the aspiration of accountability. We go to vote, that is the core of the practice of democracy, and we go to vote in order to be able to hold our governments accountable. If we don't like what they do, if we don't like their explanations and justification for their actions, the art of voting allows us to impose rewards and sanctions on our governments. In the most simple form, the art of voting is an expression of the aspiration of accountability that is core to the idea of democracy. Yet, if we think about how our democracy functions, it's quite clear that that relationship, even though it's intrinsic, doesn't actually come together in the simplest of ways. One would imagine the act of voting itself would ensure that systems are accountable in a way that ensures that those who are voting and those who are exercising the power of imposing rewards and sanctions are in a position to ensure that it is their voices that are being reflected in that act of voting. We would have a structure of accountability. But everything that we know about how democracy functions in India today starts confusing and muddying the waters of that relationship between democracy and accountability. And the reason for that, as many political scientists have grappled with, this has been a subject of deep engagement in political science, has to do with the articulation of democracy in a context of deep social inequality. The paradox of democracy in India has been studied quite a lot and has been a puzzle that many political scientists have wondered about. How has India had a strong, vibrant democracy in a context of deep social inequality? Myron Wiener, who back in the 1980s wrote a seminal work on Indian politics, described India's democracy as one of the great puzzles of a society racked with violent conflict, but still manages to produce a democracy that endures. And India's voters hold their democracy very strong. In 2014, 66.4% of Indian voters came out to vote. Compare that with the United States, that in the last election had one of its highest voter turnouts at 58%. And what's unique about India is that it's not you and I who go out to vote. Some of us perhaps do, but it is the poor of India, those of India who are most dependent on the state and who are perhaps the ones that suffer from the violence of the state the most, that go out to vote. So it is the poorest who go out to vote. And yet, there are important questions to be asked about whether the ability of democracy and the institutions of democracy that we have created are able to produce outcomes that are acceptable and freely chosen by all of our citizens. The answer to that is obvious. While democracy brings together a new set of representators for India on a regular basis, it is quite clear that democracy isn't necessarily ensuring that all of India has full access to basic services, that all of India engages with the state in terms of strong socio-economic rights. And this is one of the great puzzles. Democracy in India has emerged as a very powerful site for negotiating group identity. It has become a powerful site for groups who have hitherto been alienated from the state, who have been underrepresented, who have been marginalized to access the state. But in the process of that access of the state, they have mostly accessed the state for accessing of that power rather than accessing of that state to be able to create a shared identity of social transformation. It is, as Pratap Bhanu Mehta has argued, a democracy that has advanced through competitive negotiations amongst different groups, each competing for their group identity to access state power, but through that power, holding the state accountable for their identity rather than holding the state accountable for providing socio and economic rights to the poor, to everybody. In this sense, democracy has ensured for Indians a source of deep political freedom that I think Indians hold dear, especially in times when those political freedoms are questioned. For the most part, we have survived many moments where those political freedoms have almost been taken away. But democracy for India has not ensured the provision of socio-economic rights. Democracy for India has given us a strong sense of political citizenship, but democracy for India has not given us a strong sense of social and economic citizenship. And this, I think, is the core challenge of accountability that India faces. Our democracy has been able to ensure that many multiple voices get heard, that many multiple identities have a seat on the table and have a source of representation. But that source of representation hasn't necessarily created a state that is accountable for the provision of socio and economic rights to its citizens. In that sense, democracy has given us a complicated citizenship. A citizenship that is political, but a citizenship that is not determined in the framework of rights, of social and economic rights and obligations to its citizens. And that is the great challenge that we face in our democracy today. And that is why the entire idea of accountability in our democracy today is essentially an idea of strengthening citizenship from the perspective of deepening these socio-economic rights. The poor of India today interact with the state not so much as equal citizens. They interact with the state very much in a framework of patronage and in a framework of power dispensation. The notion, in Hindi we call it the Mai Baap Sarkar. The government is my mother, the government is my father. It is a paternalistic relationship. There is a deep dependence on the state. But it isn't quite clear that the state will will give to citizens the rights that citizens bear. The interaction with the state is not an interaction of equals. The interaction with the state is not an interaction that is an interaction in the framework of rights, as rights-bearing citizens. It is an interaction based on patronage. It is an interaction that is framed in terms of a patron-client relationship. And the quest for accountability in India has in fact been very much a quest that is trying to invert that particular relationship, invert the relationship between citizens and states in a way that reframes these relationships in the language of rights. India is one of the few countries that has in fact found space for mobilization for these rights outside of its political space, perhaps because of this very complicated puzzle between democracy and accountability, and the ability of democracy to deliver on mutually acceptable rights, social and economic rights to all its citizens. This mobilization has largely been taking place in what we call civil society, that space between formal politics and the formal market, the in-between space where citizens organize, interact, mobilize, and put pressure on the states. And that mobilization has largely been in the language of rights, pursuing accountability through the language of rights. And it is in that pursuance that about a decade or so ago, India legislated for a range of socio-economic rights: the right to information, the right to work, the right to food, the right to education, all of which were a pursuit for accountability, but through an inversion of the relationship that citizens have with the state. But it's also important to understand how democracy that pursued that emerged as a site for negotiations of group identity and access to state power also in many ways undermined the functioning of the state, especially at the local level. By that I mean the functioning of the government at the district level, at the block level, at the panchayat level, at the point at which the government actually in fact matters most to the people of this country. For all of us, the government occasionally lays roads. There's a lot of potholes in them, and when we don't like them, we can privatize and build our own roads. When our electricity fails, we'll bring our own generators. When the quality of water on our taps is not so good, we put in our aqua purifiers. When the air in Delhi is impossible to breathe, we lock ourselves up in our homes and we put in our air purifiers. For most of us sitting in this room, we live a deeply privatized life. That, in fact, has been our solution to the challenge of accountability and the failure of our democracy to deliver on our socio-economic rights. We just exit. That is perhaps one expression of accountability, a deeply problematic one, but it is one expression of accountability. For the vast majority of India, they do not have the choice to exit, and they remain locked in deeply complicated relationships with the state at the district, the block, and the panchayat level. The state at the district and block and the panchayat level has been studied quite deeply by many, has been experienced very much by many as a state that is in many ways extremely violent. It's violence not in the form of physical violence, but it's violence in the form of patronage dispensation, which ensures that few, and specifically the identified groups, benefit from the state. When you think of the panchayat, when you think of the block, when you think of the district, that idea of the corrupt state, which today on the television is about large scams between various big business houses, most of whom are quite far removed from our lives. But the other aspect of corruption, which is very much an experience in the everyday on the ground, all comes from this notion of the state as being a source of access to power, access to the state for that government job, to access the powers of the state, and then dispense that patronage as you will. The local Indian state has been documented as a state where jobs are available pretty much on the market. In fact, one of the most interesting seminal pieces of work that first brought this out was of a study of an irrigation scheme here in Tamil Nadu, where engineers' jobs were up for sale because of the many government schemes that were being run and the money that could, and the bribes that could be sought and the money that could be got. So the state on the ground has been very much seen as a space which is accruing power and dispensing it at its will, leaving citizens very much at the behest of the will and fancy of the state. So that whole idea of the Mai Baap Sarkar, the state dispensing its patronage, very much visible mostly at the local level of the state, which is a consequence of the dynamics of democracy as it evolved, and which poses in many ways the most critical challenge to the idea of accountability. Why is it that the people who vote the most and who are most dependent on the state are not able to push the state to deliver on the rights that are constitutionally theirs? It is in that kind, the state at the local level that has been most evocatively described as a state that looks like a state in some very formal sense. There's an office, there are files, there are phones, there are papers, there are computers. But in all respects, is not a government that functions on the basis of those files, those computers, and those records. It is a government that functions on very different principles of power and patronage dispensation. And the whole narrative of accountability in India has very much been a narrative that is trying to change that dynamic at the local level. Changing that dynamic not necessarily directly through the political system, but by trying to create an alternative politics within the space of civil society. How has all of this worked out in practice? Economists talk about the idea of accountability very much in terms of incentives. If there are systems of pressure, if you change the nature of the contract, behavior changes. So when we talk about the problems of the government being, jobs being bought and sold, or patronage being dispensed in unequal ways, the answer often is change the terms of the contract, put in pay for performance, start measuring how the government functions. That's very much how the global development literature also thought about the idea of accountability, as something that could be changed by virtue of changing a contract. Change the terms of the contract, and the government will start behaving differently. What was really important about what happened and has happened in India over the last decade or two is that it pushed that to say the relationship between government and its people is not a relationship that is framed in a contract. The relationship between government and people is a relationship that is based on a very complex dynamic of interactions and politics at the very local level, and it is that politics that has to be changed. The evolution of that is also quite interesting, because what it tried to do was to say the way in which we can make the state accountable, the idea of accountability, was to ensure that the government started becoming more visible to its people. This was the core of the idea of the right to information. The Indian government, in its form and function, in its materiality, is very much a government that functions on paper. As accountants, I'm sure you can relate to that. You walk into a government office and all you see are reams and reams of files and Godrej cupboards that have been bought over many, many decades, in which there are reams and reams of files. It is, as a sociologist, Amita Bhaviskar, described the Indian state as a government that has a passion for paper. Everything that the government does is always on paper. The reality of what the government does might be quite different. The form of the government is always on paper. And the movement for accountability essentially tried to take that paper and make it visible to people. That was its core. It said that if the power of the government is in that paper, and we access that paper, and that paper becomes visible to citizens, that itself will force the government to start answering. The nature of that answering, the nature of that explanation would have to be based on how the government operates. The force of that paper is critical. And in order to push the government, it also created a very carefully designed set of laws that essentially worked the dynamic of the paper. So one of the important things about the bureaucracy in India is the passion for paper means once you open a file, everything starts moving. The right to information in its architecture and in its design essentially forced the government to open a file for the citizen. You have to go in with a formal piece of paper. You place that piece of paper to the government. It enters a file. And the cycle of that file means something starts moving. So the power of accountability, of the accountability quest in India, has very much been in its ability to try and make the state visible by using its own instruments, taking the paper and pushing the paper out through a process that is also based on paper. And because it's using the government's own instruments, it has to start responding. So if you look at some of the statistics, ever since India passed the Right to Information law in 2004, we have on average nearly 7 million applications for the right to information on an annual basis. And each of these applications always pushes to give you a response. By and large, about 60 to 70% of these applications get a response. What the response says, we'll talk about in a moment, but it gets a response. But the idea of accountability didn't just limit itself to moving the government's paper outside of the Godrej cupboards in the government into the hands of citizens. The idea of accountability also wanted to try and find a more tangible expression of these papers in forms where we as citizens could start directly questioning the government and pushing the government to start answering our questions. And this was a very exciting practice where essentially all of us as citizens can convert ourselves into what you do, into becoming accountants and auditors. Quite literally taking the very papers that we access from the government and going around to see whether what is stated in that piece of paper is actually reflected in the reality. This is the practice of social auditing, that through the government papers and through citizens becoming auditors allows citizens then to start asking questions of government. And the practice of social auditing culminates into quite literally a physical court hearing, somewhat like this, where representatives of government are called and citizens use the papers of government to start asking questions. So the power of what has happened in India over the last decade or so, of trying to pursue the quest of accountability by inverting the relationship between citizens and government away from one of patronage, but one that takes the government's own instruments and begins to ask questions of government, is in many ways a very, very significant and poignant effort to reiterate the relationship and the experience and the practice of citizenship, and in that process changing the dynamics of democracy. The question that has to be asked, of course, is that enough? In a sense, what the movement for accountability in India has thus far done is that it has taken the idea of accounting and tried to push the government to be a better accountant of itself, asking it questions physically, tangibly, sometimes in a very everyday sense, sometimes in a faraway sense, file a right to information, get information about what the government is doing, place it in the newspapers, animate a conversation. It is essentially thus far been about extracting information from the government and forcing the state to become a better accountant of its activities. It doesn't, I believe, move further into asking the question of whether the account that the government is giving is necessarily the right account. What it does ensure is that it can tell you, it makes the government more visible, it makes the government more open, it makes the government more transparent, but it doesn't deepen the conversation into asking the question of whether the accounting that the government is giving of itself is in fact the appropriate account, and how does one transform that. That to me is one of the most critical challenges that we have. And the reason I say this is that if you look over the last decade and a half at how this practice of accountability has taken place, you start getting a better sense of what the limitations are of how government functions in and of itself. Let me give you a few examples. I began my career when we first began Accountability Initiative, we began looking very closely at how government puts its accounts in place. And we discovered that the structure of our government, which is so deeply hierarchical, after all, we inherited a particular bureaucracy that was designed to perform a very different function to the function or development as it was being asked to of today. And it is ingrained in itself to be extremely hierarchical and to be in many ways very distanced from people, which is why the practice of accessing power of the state enabled the state to further distance itself and strengthen the power of the power holder of the state. That distance meant that there's a deep sense of lack of trust in the state's ability to do even the basic things of following the books of accounts inside of the government. So power gets located very far away from where the action happens. And that gets translated into very simple and very problematic experiences of what happens with government. The government of India, when we began studying the education program, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is a program for primary schools, and it's meant to ensure that all children come to schools. It's meant to promote universal education in India. It's a program that has been running for the last 15 or 20 years. And on its paper was designed quite sensibly. It said that the school and the children and parents of all the students that come to those schools are the ones that perhaps know best what the school needs. And therefore, the school must make its own plan for what it needs to do. Of course, you can't budget sitting in New Delhi for every single individual school. So that budget then those plans have to get aggregated somewhere. So they go from the school to the block, to the district, to the state, to New Delhi, to Parliament, where a budget gets announced, and the money starts moving slowly down. The idea was in order for the school to be able to implement what it wants, the school must have a small amount of money that it can use as it sees fit. So in the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, all schools are given a certain amount of money which they can use for whatever small repair and maintenance work as they see fit. When we began to study this process, we realized that most schools were complaining that they didn't have the ability to in fact use this money for anything that they needed. There were a set of schools in rural Bihar which were still awaiting funds for a building. These were schools that were running literally under a tree. Back in Chennai, back in Tamil Nadu, there was a private aided school had a fire in mid 2000s when they were cooking the midday meal, and as a consequence of that, the government of India imposed a very sensible set of rules to ensure that all schools have fire safety equipment, so that in case there is an untoward incident, they have the equipment that they can use in order to be able to ensure that fires don't cause damage. It took a few years for those rules to reach the schools of rural Bihar. But a government order was issued, and that order required that all schools purchase fire safety equipment using this money that they had received for their own school-related activities. So the schools in Bihar that did not have any school buildings had to now use their money that they could well have used, perhaps to rent a building, hire a new teacher, get better uniforms, buy better textbooks, any number of things, to buy fire safety equipment, even though they didn't actually have a school building. Because the nature of power and the way in which power gets exercised within the government, through its papers, through its rules, and through its orders, requires a certain kind of functioning and a certain set of activities that have to be performed at the school level. In this case, any amount of effort to exercise accountability by parents from the school fell to naught, because after all, the rules required the system to function in a particular way. Our systems are designed in ways where the hierarchy of decision making is taken so far away from where the actual experience of the government is, that any kind of decision tends very often to have very little relevance with the reality of how government is functioning on the ground. We have, our constitution mandates that we have a three-tiered system of government. That that we have a federal system that has a government at the center, a government at the state, and a set of panchayats at the local and municipalities. Yet we have done everything in our power to ensure that local governments have the least amount of resources and capability to implement. And the rationale for that is always about the need for the system to have better accounting. How can I give my panchayats so much money? They are all corrupt. How will we account for it? So this notion of accounting has in many ways taken power away from the point of the local level, at the point at which decisions actually get implemented, and move the state in many ways very, very far away from where it's implemented. What that does is that it completely transforms the language and the narrative within which people within the government interact with each other. We always think of the government very much as a place where people come in to access power. Teachers, doctors, engineers, block officers, administrators at the local level often don't show up. They are very corrupt. They are well known to be a set of apathetic actors. But in my work, when we began to have conversations with these officers, it struck me as quite puzzling that every conversation would always begin with a narrative of powerlessness. We are nothing, say officers at the local level, but mere post officers. I've heard this in Bihar, I've heard this in Rajasthan, I've heard this in Andhra Pradesh, I've heard this in Maharashtra, I've heard this in Madhya Pradesh, where across the country, in numerous conversations with government officers at the local level, you often hear this story of them describing themselves as not more than post officers. And not post officers in the typical sense of efficiency, moving a piece of paper from top to bottom to make sure the letter reaches on time to the right person. But post officers in terms of people who are simply moving paper up and down without the ability to actually take any decision over the nature of that paper. When we've been asking officers through all our surveys and interactions, what would you do? What is the role that you play in administration? What would you do to improve the quality of your schools? What would you do to improve the quality of your health centers? What would you do to improve the quality of your roads? They mostly shrug their shoulders and say, what can I do? I'm just a post officer. In fact, in one interview, a block education officer in Bihar, who you could tell had a sense of power, because as we sat in his room, everyone who came in and out was shouted at and told to go away, because he is the boss, and he had his little buzzer that he would buzz to get people in and out, to show that he was in a position of power. When we asked him what he would do to improve the schools in his area, he shrugged his shoulders and said, well, if the government wants to, the government can do a lot. And it struck us as strange that here is somebody who is sitting in the government's office, accessing the power of the government, yet his description of what power he has and his description of the government itself is seen as something quite distanced from where he is. The government is seen, even for government actors, as something that is capable of doing a lot, but that capability rests somewhere very far away, not quite here for me in my position. Which means that whenever they are tasked to do things, the understanding of what they do is very much determined in terms of responding to orders, moving forward, and giving information back up to where that information was asked. We have, in the course of our work, very carefully and minutely accounted for how these local level officers actually go about their day. And here's what we discovered. Take the example of a block education officer. He or she, mostly they are he, start their day with a phone call or an order that they have got from their district bosses. In Madhya Pradesh, in fact, I recall when we were doing this accounting, we arrived at the block education officer's office, and he came looking very harassed because he had just got a call saying, stop everything that you are supposed to do. Today is the day that the government is going to be doing Surya Namaskars in place of the attendance and the morning prayers, and you have to make sure that the Surya Namaskars are happening in each and every school in your block. That's about 250 schools. So everything was suspended as he went about making some phone calls, trying to figure out if the Surya Namaskars had actually been done. The order determines what the officer is supposed to do, and that order always comes from the top in an ad hoc way, asking for information that is then passed on and circles back. In all of these cases, we found that for the majority of the 7 hours or 8 hours of work that they do, 5 of them are spent responding to orders. 2 of them are spent having tea, having lunch, talking to friends. 1 hour is spent talking to visitors, but never really parents. Mostly visitors who are responding to the information that they need to give to their bosses. During the time that we tracked these, this was the time when the planning was supposed to be done for the schools. Not one of these officers had the time or the chance to go off to actually see what was happening in schools, because they were responding to orders. And the reason they were responding to orders is because they recognize that power rests on the top. What all of this does is that it creates a narrative of what it means to be in government. It creates a narrative of what it means to be in government as not much else but a powerless cog in the wheel that functions quite passively, responding to orders from the top, rather than ever having to think about the core goal of what it means to be in government, which is the goal of delivering public services, which is the goal of ensuring that rights of all citizens are protected. So much so that when you ask officers at that level, what is your idea of public service? You'll usually hear them tell you, it is about ensuring that schemes are delivered. It is about ensuring that formats move from the bottom to the top. It is about ensuring that the database that I set up is complete. It is about accounting for my activities rather than ever thinking about what goal or what role I am supposed to play as a public servant. Why am I spending so much time on this? The reason is that when we think about the idea of accountability, we often miss one essential element of accountability, which is the account. Accountability is very much determined not just through a process of accounting, telling you the 1 plus 1 of what I do. Accountability is also very much determined by how the account of who I am is framed. What do I mean by account? And here I draw on some of the work of economist Lan Pritchett, who has been studying the idea of accountability in the public sector quite deeply, and not so much as an economist who thinks about contracts, but much more almost as a sociologist who's thinking about accountability very much in terms of the lived experiences of actors and their relationships. The account, he says, is a set of narratives that we bring together to describe ourselves in our particular context, in our particular professions. After all, as chartered accountants within a professional network, there are a set of words that you would use to describe yourself, that determine your profession, that determine your pride in your profession, and how you justify your actions is very much shaped by that. But if, as our government officers are, if the account of who they are is based on being no more than powerless cogs in a wheel, that are part of a large hierarchy where power rests somewhere so far away that every time I go to my boss, I'm usually just shouted at. I have sat in countless meetings in district offices where district collectors are talking to all their officers. Usually those meetings function in terms of the district collector barking orders at everybody, asking why things have not been done, and storming out. Very little effort to actually talk to officers about what exactly it is they're doing, how they're going about doing their jobs, what are the challenges. Those are not the conversations that happen in these kinds of settings, where seniors in the system, the hierarchy of the system, always looks at the local as something that is not quite to be trusted, something that is deeply corrupt, something that is deeply compromised, something that has to only deliver on information that I am asked so I can do my job, rather than something that is empowered and may actually have something to say. This dynamic of power within the government, within the institutions of our democracy are such that it fundamentally undermines the experiences of those who are actually performing the services of what our government institutions should be. And therefore, our accounts of ourselves, when the account of the government is defined so much as an account that is very much anchored in a narrative of powerlessness, of not being able to do much, of, as one officer described, whose post is Cluster Resource Center Coordinator, CRCC. He says, I respond to orders when I'm asked, and for the rest of the time I think of my job as complete rest in comfortable conditions. When that is the account of yourself, the idea of being accountable is only limited to responding to what I'm being asked for, rather than being accountable for the job or the goals that I am expected to be accountable for. And what this does in that larger quest of accountability, when we as citizens have spaces through tools like the right to information or through processes of social auditing to start asking questions of the system, it often means that the government isn't able to quite respond. It isn't able to respond in a way that effectively fulfills expectations of citizens. Let me give you one example. In the experience of social auditing, which I've studied quite closely, one of the things that we found is there are occasions, of course, when issues of corruption come up and records are reported, handed back to government to actually do something about it. Very often you find the government is simply unable to. The same officer comes back. And the reason for that is precisely because the government is organized in such a way that those particular officers don't fall within the rules of the Rural Development Department that was implementing the social audit, and so nothing could be done about it. Even more importantly, when you're trying to ensure that the activities that are done in fact actually represent what is needed, and the money did not reach, because the money is not given to you to actually, so in a very tangible way. For instance, one panchayat wants to build a road, but the government, the district decides that that road is not, that's not the point at which the road has to be built. This has to be converged with the Swachh Bharat program, and a toilet has to be built. So your social audit might point out that the money is being spent on something that is not relevant for the village at that point, but the ability of the government to respond is simply not there, simply because the way in which the government has been organized and the way in which decisions actually get taken. And that then leaves you with a system that is trying to open itself out to do something, but is simply not being able to be responsive. In a sense, the real challenge of accountability that we face in India today, I believe, is a challenge of a system that has been designed to be accountable in the purest sense of an accounting system. A system that knows how to respond to all the auditors when the auditors come, to demonstrate on their books of paper that they know they've been able to ensure that 1 + 1 = 2, that the utilization certificate has reached where it should, so that it looks like the accountant, that the accounting has been done effectively. But the ability of the system to account for itself on the basis of a narrative that really is about ensuring that the socio and economic rights of citizens are protected. That is a narrative about ensuring that people actually are able to participate in the decisions of government. This system is simply not designed for that. And because of the nature of the design, the account of the system is very much of being as far away from people and as unresponsive to people as it possibly can. And that, I think, is the core challenge of accountability that India faces today. Where do we go from here? In our current framing, we often now have begun to talk about accountability as something that can be fixed by technology. That's the new game in town. The problems of our government systems, the inability of the system to respond to people, is a problem that can quite easily be solved by using technology. If money doesn't reach, use your Aadhaar number and bank accounts will be miraculously opened and all problems will be solved. If there is corruption in the system, a new kind of biometric technology can be used to ensure that corruption disappears. We have never actually effectively, again, what we have tried to do is to think about the problem of accountability very much as a problem of accounting, where now technology can also become a new additional tool for accounting. But again, we never ask the central question: what is the actual problem that we are trying to solve? And can technology in fact really shift the account of the actors within government in a way that makes the government much more responsive to the people that it is supposed to serve? So when technology gets deployed, for instance, to make sure that doctors show up, use biometric attendance, or to ensure that teachers show up, use biometric attendance in schools, these are some of the fixes that we are bringing in on a fairly regular basis. All it does is create one more piece of equipment that the teachers, the doctors, the engineers, and everyone else in the government system is quite adept at gaming. And suddenly you find a little bit of oil on the fingertips and the biometric system is not working anymore, and everybody is back to exactly where we began with. Because we try to impose a new tool to solve a problem, the problem of accounting, without effectively engaging with the problem of changing the account. Changing the account, I believe, requires a much deeper understanding of what it means to make governments much, much more decentralized. It requires a rethinking of where power is located in our institutions of governance. It requires a rethinking of where power, of the relationship of power between citizens, and the government in a way where power actually starts getting decentralized, and the government, at the point at which it engages with people, is in a position to be genuinely responsive. We need to genuinely move the practice of democracy away from a practice that worries a lot about what happens in the state elections and what happens in the national elections, to a practice of democracy that spends far more time worrying about what happens between the Gram Panchayat elections, the Taluka elections, and the Zilla Parishad elections. One of the reasons we don't have that vibrant conversation in our democracy is because our political parties themselves are in fact exactly the same kind of character as the institutions of the government are. They are deeply centralized. They too locate power at a very, very great distance away from where the actual experience of democracy should take place. So I see the structure of our politics, the structure of our party politics, and the structure of our government as two very integral systems that are feeding off each other, both of which are creating a narrative of democracy that is in fact very centralized and that is in fact very, very far away from our people. And it is that distance that is creating breaking away that relationship between accountability and democracy. It is a relationship that can only be restored if we have a genuine commitment to a deeper decentralization of our politics and a deeper decentralization of our governance. It also means that we have to start engaging much more closely with the idea of trust. The idea of trust, both in terms of the relationship between us and citizens and our governments. We always think of our government, it's almost easy to argue that everybody in government is corrupt. Hum sab chor hain, as we say, wo sab chor hain, as we say in Hindi. But it is important to move beyond that narrative of corruption, to begin to start understanding where and how these forms of corruption emerge, and what are the ways in which these forms of corruption can start becoming, can start moving much more by empowering actors within government to be more responsive to us, by empowering them with funds, by empowering them with responsibilities, and as citizens therefore using the power of our votes to exercise our vote and to change that relationship of trust. But equally important, we need to reflect much more on how to shift the narrative of trust within the institutions of democracy, within our governments. How does one move away from a narrative where the first thing that an administrator does, the elite administration, the IAS, comes into a district and inevitably will say, I am the only one that knows what needs to be done. The block education officer, the block development officer, the village extension officer, none of them really know. And that lack of trust is what shapes that relationship of hierarchy and the grammar of authority with which the administration functions, which ensures that those who are actually tasked with implementing the role of government, those who are actually tasked with implementing schemes, with implementing programs, have a very little say in what actually happens on the ground. We make changes on the top and we rarely think to ask whether those changes have in fact been communicated to people on the ground. I noticed this most tangibly when in 2010 Parliament passed something called the right to education. Sounded very grand. The Indian government was praised globally for moving so fast and so forwardly towards universal education that every child in India has a right to education. I asked block education officers in different parts of the country, what does it mean now that you have a right to education? They looked quite confused, scratched their heads and said, I suppose it means we can go to people and we can say to them, a new law has come, if you don't send your child to school, you'll go to jail. Now you could argue that this is yet again the apathetic, power-hungry bureaucrat who's looking at people as something, as an unruly set of subjects who need to be disciplined. But if you think about it a little harder, there is a moment of sympathy that I felt for these officers who have always been told that Qanun is something that you have to implement, but never actually being told what Qanun means when the Qanun is applicable to you, when the law is applicable to you, when you have to move away from dispensing a program to implementing a right. At no point in any of the training or any of the interactions that any of these officers had with their superiors as this new law was formed, were they ever given to understand that there's a whole new sensitivity and a whole new sensibility around which they are supposed to implement. Because we think of our local governments as corrupt, as invisible, as people that we cannot trust. And until we don't change that trust, we will not change the account of our local government, of our local bureaucrats, of those who people are institutions of democracy. And without changing that account, we will not have an accountable state. We might get an accounting democracy, a democracy that keeps all of you very busy as you match the books of accounts together to make sure that the utilization certificates are in place, that the vouchers are in place. But we are unlikely to get a democracy that is truly accountable to its citizens in that it ensures that in all of its actions it responds to the needs and priorities of its people. Thank you.
An audience listening to income tax, information technology, GST of late, it is an overwhelming reception of a flow of knowledge on the economic development, macroeconomic development, wherein a new definition of accountability has been established by respected Madam. Thank you so much. You have clearly explained the interrelationship between public governance and the term accountability, and the explanations and the responses of public responses, and accountability being the core of democracy. And the accountability, the strength of citizenship, and we only feel that we as a professional institution, and we should also contribute for establishing so much accountability in the public governance. Thank you so much. And we are willing to show our respect and the gratitude for Madam Ms. Yamini Aiyar for sparing her valuable time to be amongst us to speak on one of the most relevant topics in the macroeconomic scenario. I would like to take the pleasant privilege of requesting Honorable Gopalakrishna Gandhi sir, our former Governor West Bengal, to come forward to present a memento to Ms. Yamini Aiyar. I request our chartered accountant Venkatram from Mumbai who has spared his valuable time to be amongst us and who is contributing for the fund for this memorial trust to come forward to propose a formal note of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have been given the pleasant task of proposing a vote of thanks. Thank you very much, Yamini, for giving such a brilliant exposition that we chartered accountants have never had. We're so used to our bookkeeping and accounting and auditing that you have unraveled before us the democratic practice of accountability which we really need today in this country. There is a vast divide between what government thinks, and you put it across very ably and correctly that we have enough of legislation, but the reality on the ground is quite different. And I would only suggest, if the Institute can, in due course of time, look at including social audit from this perspective as one of their subjects, it would help in the long run, because the profession is facing innumerable challenges, and I think one way in which we could face up to such challenges is to ensure that our professionals participate in that level, in that strata of society, and contribute. I also take this opportunity to thank the SIRC, who have been extremely generous in affording us this auditorium on an annual basis. And last but not the least, the crowd, we request you to continue to extend your support as you have been doing all these years, and we look forward to many more years of this memorial lecture in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. On behalf of the SIRC also, I would like to place on our sincere gratitude to our Honorable Sankar Aiyar sir for continuing to bring luminaries for this memorial lecture. We used to request them that whoever we want to listen as an office, as a member, and as a profession, we are interacting with our professionals, and they look forward to many more this economics oriented thing, and he is very kind enough to bring this memorial lecture very lively, very useful for the profession. Thank you so much, sir. With this, we are concluding this memorial lecture. I request everyone to stand up for the national anthem. Thank you. Thank you.